Often forgotten on the list of Axis powers of the Second World War is Finland, which fought alongside the Germans in the war against the Soviet Union. While the Finns were never really ideologically aligned with the Nazi regime, they were in a precarious position that led to an alliance. And as the war shifted against the Germans, they were forced into another difficult decision to betray that alliance in hopes of getting mercy from the Soviets. On September 19th, 1944, that's exactly what they did, and it led to a little-remembered front of the Second World War fought entirely north of the Arctic Circle. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Finland was first embroiled in World War II when the Soviet Union invaded on November 30th, 1939. The Soviets expected the war to be swift and decisive. They had a significant advantage in terms of manpower, armored units, and air units, and the underpowered Finnish army had more than 1,200 kilometers of border to protect. The Finns surprised much of the world when they were able to halt much of the Soviet offensive, but leadership in Finland was well aware that they lacked the supplies or manpower for an extended war on their own, and potential allies were not forthcoming. No one wanted to commit to a war against the Soviets. In an offensive in early 1940, the Soviets pierced the Finnish defensive line. The peace that was finally negotiated and signed in Moscow on March 12, 1940, was bad for Finland, ending with Finland ceding significant borderlands, including half of Karelia, to the Soviet Union, which included much of the Finnish industrial center. 422,000 Finns were evacuated to the new border, a staggering 12% of the Finnish population. Despite the peace, neither the Finns nor the Soviets thought that the conflict was over. Finland immediately sought greater guarantees in friendship with other countries like the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Norway, and the Third Reich. Hope remained that Finland could regain the land lost and that the peace was only temporary. The term interim peace became popular. Finland never revoked the state of war, allowing the government to censor critics and anti-Soviet speech. The army immediately began rearming and building a new defensive line. In 1940, military expenditures reached 45% of the nation's budget. Continued Soviet pressure and the occupation of the Baltic states left Finland certain that war would come again. Germany's invasion of Denmark and Norway in April of 1940 worsened the situation. There was no more safe trade routes to reach Finland. Seeing few other options, Finland turned to Germany. Anti-Nazi media was suppressed. In late July, a secret German representative began asking Finland about fighting the Soviets. In August, Hitler restarted arms deliveries to Finland, and an agreement was reached that allowed German troop transfer rights in exchange for arms. Especially valuable to Hitler were the supplies of Finnish nickel, which German planners thought could easily satisfy German demand for decades. In anticipation of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans established bases and supply depots throughout Finland and northern Norway. Soviet Minister Molotov demanded that Germany halt its support to Finland, but the Reich instead demanded that there be no more military activity in northern Europe for the time being. Beginning in May of 1941, the Finns were brought in on planning for the invasion. German forces began moving from bases in Norway on June 22nd, and the invasion began. Hitler declared that Germany would attack in the north in alliance with the Finnish Freedom Heroes, despite an official declaration of neutrality by Finland. No attacks were launched from Finnish territory until after June 25th, when Soviet forces struck Finland, bombing both military and civilian targets. This began the so-called Continuation War, in which the Finns insisted that they were not allies of the Germans, but co-belligerents. The Finns never signed the Tripartite Pact like Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Bulgaria did, but did sign the Anti-Comintern Pact. They also provided volunteers for a Finnish SS unit. The main goal of the war was to regain territory lost during the Winter War, although expansion was not ruled out. Some parties in Finland argued for a Greater Finland, which incorporated areas of the Soviet Union. The northern front of the Nazi-Soviet era was, however, fairly small compared to further south. Finnish forces recaptured land lost in the 1940 treaty, cut off supply routes to Leningrad, and captured territory in East Karelia. In the far north, German and Finnish assaults failed to capture the important port of Murmansk. Finnish forces refused to be committed any further in the siege of Leningrad. The fronts remained essentially stable for most of 3 years until the Soviets restarted offensive operations in the fall of 1944. Soviet offensives lifted the siege of Leningrad on January 27, 1944, and broke through Finnish lines in Karelia on June 9th. With Germany collapsing on the Eastern Front, the Finns sued for peace, receiving terms on August 29, 1944. The peace was not much better for the Finns than the previous one, ceding slightly more land than they had in the first treaty and an agreement to pay significant reparations. It also, of course, demanded that Finland break ties with Germany and expel German troops from the country. The agreement was accepted by the Finnish parliament on September 18th. The president resigned and was replaced by General Karl Mannerheim. Mannerheim wrote a letter to the Germans before he acquiesced to Soviet demands, writing that our German brothers in arms will forever remain in our hearts, but that I deem it my duty to lead my people out of the war. The Moscow armistice, which preceded an actual treaty, left an awkward position in parts of Finland, especially the far north, where German forces had been stationed since 1940. There were sizable stores of supplies, along with forces themselves. As early as September 1943, German command had recognized the need to make plans if Finland exited the war. This became imperative by February of 1944. German forces planned to occupy several islands to maintain control of the Baltic Sea, while the main job involved the shifting of the 20th Mountain Army under General Rendulic in Finland's north under Operation Birch. Operation Birch was not a small undertaking. The army was over 200,000 men strong and had to pivot across a huge swath of land with limited lines of withdrawal, defend a new line facing south, and face the risk of winter blocking all escape. While holding on to the Murmansk front, the army was expected to disengage from the enemy, withdraw north, and occupy new defenses to maintain control over Finnish nickel. All of this with units that were largely not motorized and, while essentially cut off from Germany. 180,000 tons of military supplies, fuel, and foodstuffs began to be moved from central Finland throughout the spring. When the armistice was announced early in September, the Germans had to assume the Soviet forces would outflank the German army without opposition from the Finns. A grace period was allowed for the Germans' voluntary withdrawal until September 15th. Despite the betrayal by the Finns, Hitler hoped to salvage as much of the disaster as possible in order for the relationship with the Finns to be handled in a friendly and compromising manner, in the hopes that it would keep the Finns from assisting the Soviets too enthusiastically. But Finnish troops were already moving to expel German forces in accordance with the armistice. The first fighting between Finnish and German forces took place in the Gulf of Finland, when German troops landed on the island of Gotland. The Germans were unable to push off the Finns, who were supported by Soviet air forces. 153 Germans were killed and more than 1,200 captured. By September 13th, a significant number of non-essential troops and over 40,000 tons of supplies were evacuated by the Germans, although around 13,000 tons of supplies would be lost on board ships that had been leased from the Finns. Another 106,000 tons of supplies were destroyed. The German withdrawal was precarious as it disengaged from Soviet forces. The Germans were also wary of Finnish troop movements, uncertain if they were hostile. Positively for the Germans, the Soviet troops didn't pursue withdrawing German forces across the Finnish border. By the middle of September, most of the Finnish army was in the position opposite the slowly withdrawing Germans. Neither side really wanted to fight. The Germans wanted to withdraw intact, and the Finns had no desire to see war ravage their country. This interest led to a secret agreement between the Finnish and German military authorities, in which the Germans agreed to limit the devastation of the country, and the Finns to facilitate the Germans' withdrawal. Finnish historian Les Westerlund went so far as to call the Lapland War the sham war. There was cooperation. German-Finnish cooperation helped 133,000 Finnish refugees to be evacuated from the region. There was also disagreement. Finnish coastal batteries fired on German ships. Liaison officers were disarmed and German baggage was detained. German liaison officer General Voldemar Erfurth wrote that the engagements were by no means sham fights in order to make the Russians believe the Finns had fulfilled their obligations, but the fighting was real. Fighting in some areas of the withdrawal was bloody, as Germans, angry about Finnish betrayal, took out their frustrations on the country, and Finnish soldiers retaliated. The Germans began a scorched earth policy as they continued to withdraw, burning more than 40% of the buildings in Lapland. The first significant skirmish took place on September 27th, and on September 28th, Finnish troops attempted to siege a bridge before it could be destroyed. Fighting broke out, and Finnish troops attempting to disarm explosives were killed when the Germans detonated them. Soviet forces began crossing into Finland in response to what they saw as a lack of determination in pushing out the Germans. By October 4th, German command was reporting that relations with the Finns were deteriorating quickly. Finally, the Germans decided that holding the nickel mines was unnecessary and that withdrawal of the 20th Mountain Army needed to happen quickly. Hitler approved the withdrawal, which was given the code name Northern Light. On October 1st, a regiment of Finnish troops landed at Torino behind German lines in conjunction with a planned uprising from local troops. The goal of the move was unclear. Erfurth speculated that it was the action of local commanders. Another historian suggested that the move was meant to force the Germans to hasten their withdrawal, hopefully with less destruction. The Soviets were also ratcheting up pressure on the Finns to act by the end of September. The Finns moved in several divisions, and the Germans rushed reinforcements, including the machine gun ski brigade. Fighting was heavy as the two sides pushed each other back and forth, but the Germans were unable to crush the beachhead. On October 7th, a significant force of Germans were encircled north of Torino in some of the fiercest fighting of the Lapland War. The Finns reported 1,700 casualties from the fighting, and Germans over 2,100, in addition to 400 captured and the loss of 4 tanks. With the Soviets pressing, the Finns told the Germans that no agreement contrary to the armistice had ever been made, leading the Germans to declare on October 3rd that they would no longer be pulling their punches. All cover, installations, and objects of use to the enemy are to be destroyed. Fighting broke out across the front. The town of WWII was utterly destroyed by the Germans in their retreat, especially after the accidental detonation of an ammunition train carrying 400 tons of explosives. "We sincerely regretted the fate of this city," German General Rundelich said. German retreat through northern Finland relied heavily on the weather remaining mild, as the usual October storms would make the roads impassable. It also relied on Germans of the 19th Corps holding out near Murmansk, while the rest of the army pulled back towards Norway. The 250,000 troops of the 20th Mountain Army were still scattered over 200,000 square kilometers. On October 7th, the Soviet forces at Murmansk commenced an offensive against the 19th Corps. The Germans there occupied heavy defensive lines built since 1941. Over 140,000 rounds of artillery and mortars, along with 8,500 rockets per square kilometer, were fired in the initial attack. A concentrated infantry attack followed and broke through the initial German defenses. Russian naval infantry flanked positions on the coast, while Russians began to pour through gaps in the German lines. Reinforcements were sent as quickly as possible. One officer described exhausted German soldiers de-trucking on the battlefield. Soldiers almost frozen stiff had to be committed to battle immediately. The whole corps was cut off for a time before clearing its own withdrawal route. The Germans were forced to withdraw as quickly as possible, abandoning supplies and destroying what they could. Soviet forces captured Kirkenes in Norway on October 26. Despite the disaster of the 19th Corps, the other German corps were able to withdraw successfully, thanks to weather remaining uncharacteristically mild. The Finns chased, but found themselves generally outnumbered, and their offensive operations were limited. The Finns were also rapidly demobilizing their army. The Germans from there on continued to pull their forces out of Norway and back to Germany. The last German soldier was reported to have left Finland on April 27th, now celebrated as Finland's Veterans Day. The withdrawal through Norway's Finnmark province was carried out through scorched earth policy, but neither the Finns nor the Soviets continued their pursuit. There was never an official peace agreement between Finland and Germany. In 1954, Finland merely announced that hostilities had ceased and the war was over. The German retreat in the Lapland War was nothing really short of miraculous. One American historian noted that their retreat across the Arctic was without parallel. The damage done to the Lapland region was significant, and the railway network wasn't fully operational again until 1957. The Lapland War was the result of this unique position of Finland during the Second World War, occupying sort of a gray area in a war that was often seen as black and white. For example, Finland managed to protect its small Jewish minority, members of which continued to fight in the Finnish armed forces even as they were co-belligerents with Nazi Germany. The Finnish legacy with the Germans is still a matter of controversy in Finland, but Finland managed to maintain its independence both from the Third Reich and the Soviet Union at a time when that seemed to be impossible. The Finnish relationship with the Soviet Union after the war, which was sometimes derisively referred to as Finlandization, was also controversial in its way, as was the recent decision to join NATO. Yet Finland has managed to maintain its independence in a hostile world. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.